The world outside still rushes on, heedless and indifferent, but deep in our hearts, we know that the end of humanity is drawing near. Deny it for as long as you like, but without change, annihilation is inevitable. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Angelia Camel, a professor with 15 years of research in climate change, biodiversity, and biochemistry, coupled with a master's degree in history and archaeology. My mission is to awaken humanity, to force them to confront their environmental responsibilities, but that alone is not enough. I must act. I must create positive change. My father, who instilled in me a fierce love for this planet, once said, "Even the smallest action is worth 1,000 empty words." I vow to use my last breath to preserve life for humanity, to give it a chance to survive. But this world is dominated by money, a cruel but undeniable truth. Without funding, all research, no matter how vital, quickly fades. My father experienced this bitter truth nearly 30 years ago, right here in the Andes. He was close to discovering a new energy source, a perfect alternative to fossil fuels. But then, when the principal's chair changed hands, interest in the climate vanished like sea foam. His entire body of work sank into oblivion. For the past 10 years, I have fought tirelessly to revive that work. It seemed hopeless, but I never gave up. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my father, lobbying, seeking every grant, every opportunity, no matter how small, to make this dream a reality. And then, like a miracle, 2 weeks ago, my father returned with a check from the new principal. The wind had changed direction once again, sweeping with it political calculations, but we didn't care. The number on the check far exceeded all expectations, over $1 million. I was almost speechless, my mouth agape enough to swallow my fist. I had to check the number a dozen times while my father tried to restrain himself from having a heart attack. Our excitement wasn't merely about scientific success, it was deeply personal. My mother passed away permanently while trying to uncover the strange properties of a never-before-seen mineral, hidden deep within the high mountains near the border of Colombia and Ecuador. A cave-in claimed her life and that of her entire research team, putting an end to all future excavations. Now, finally, we stand before an opportunity to prove my mother's hypotheses, to help reduce humanity's carbon footprint. The feeling was both exhilarating and strangely sacred. There was so much to prepare. Heavy machinery needed to be purchased, personnel assembled, supplies secured, an endlessly long list. My seasoned father always tried to keep me calm. "Take your time, Angelia. Thorough preparation can take months, but once the money is in hand, everything is under control," he assured me. I relied heavily on my father to communicate with the experts. Although the excavation site was still relatively intact, I knew that returning to South America and setting up camp would be no easy task. The area near the dig was extremely harsh, with temperatures swinging from arid heat to bone-chilling cold within a few miles. Winding valleys and dense, unexplored jungles often served as battlegrounds for guerrilla forces. Just reaching the site was an accomplishment in itself. Road transport was clearly impossible, as the trails were only wide enough for wild animals, completely unsuitable for the massive volume of supplies we needed to bring. Air transport, dropping cargo into the mountains, was the only viable solution, and this was our first major expense. The facilities at the site were utterly inadequate and dilapidated. Designed to accommodate a maximum of 10 to 12 people, it was old, creaky, lacking plumbing, ventilation, and modern amenities. Participants needed assurance that this journey was worthwhile, meaning they had to receive generous compensation. Monthly salaries quickly eroded the budget. We had to pay for clearing the dig site and renovating the facilities with clean water, electricity, and temperature control systems. When my father and I arrived, only 30% of the facilities were ready. The rest were overgrown with tangled vines, threatening to engulf the building at any moment. But that couldn't discourage us. The people my father found were iron-willed. They worked day and night, pushing deeper into the mountain. The harsh weather caused equipment failures, but they persevered, toiling with picks and shovels. The cold, desolate wilderness around them couldn't stop their progress. Norman, the excavation team leader, often sang folk songs to boost everyone's morale, anything to keep them alert. The unpredictable weather left us feeling lost, immersed in an indescribable sense of unease. Finally, we reached the area my mother had hypothesized, leading to a part of the earth untouched by human feet. I was horrified to see the collapsed cave, the place that had likely claimed the lives of my mother and her team, leaving behind a desolate ruin. My father motioned for Norman's team to pause, taking a minute of silence for my mother and the fallen. The air in the chamber became thick, suffocating my heart. I heard distant screams echoing in my mind, imagining my mother might have suffocated right where I stood. The thought sent shivers down my spine, fearing a similar fate could strike at any moment. But we weren't here to falter. The excavation officially began. The team worked through the night, using excavators until they could no longer function, moving colossal piles of rock and earth. Every meter deeper into the mountain felt like a century, but my father always reminded me that we were so close to our goal. "We're about to make history, Angelia. This will be a great milestone," he whispered. It took nearly 2 weeks to reach the next antechamber of the cave, a vast, magnificent space filled with rocks and lava, looking as if carved by the hands of ancient master craftsmen. Finally, we could enter on our own 2 feet. My father led the way, using the headlamp on his helmet to pierce the abyssal darkness. The air was chillingly cold, as if we had wandered into a corner of the world untouched by sunlight. I felt like I was stepping into a forbidden zone, not meant for mortal eyes. "This air probably hasn't been breathed for 600 years, or even longer," my father whispered behind us. The excavation team followed silently, carrying lanterns and picks. Dominic Legri, the expedition's professional photographer, stopped to capture every nook and cranny, every minute detail. "It's eerie," he remarked as we rounded each bend. "There's no sign of life in the cave, just faint traces of desolation, as if something has eaten away at the very ground." Even when Dominic's flash illuminated the walls, everything remained unbelievable. I was here, ready to begin discoveries that could change history, but what we sought seemed to have vanished without a trace. Only one of the smaller machines, a drill, could fit through the next tunnel. Norman and his deputy, Manuel, took turns operating it, pushing deeper into the molten rock. Phosphorus chemicals filled the air, forcing us all to quickly cover our mouths. Manuel began to cough violently, vomiting a dark red fluid, unable to cover his mouth in time. "Dr. Hallett, we need medical assistance immediately," my father said over the radio as we pulled Manuel out of the toxic fumes. I wanted to stop and check on Manuel, but my father was too focused on the excavation and what might lie ahead, so I couldn't leave him. Squeezing through the other side of the narrow passage, we gasped when we found ourselves standing on a frigid ice lake. "There's something in the ice," Norman shouted, shining his light downwards. My father moved closer, straining his eyes through the thick ice, trying to identify the strange object. "It looks like a body bag," Norman admitted, his voice full of unease. I couldn't help but shiver as I looked closer. How could this have gotten here? "Maybe it's a member of my mother's expedition and they got further than we thought," I suggested. "We won't know until we excavate the body," my father said firmly. He contacted Dr. Hallett over the radio, informing him of the situation and asking him to turn the main conference room into a makeshift morgue if possible. "We'll bring the preserved specimen up immediately," he ordered. "This isn't right at all. Look at how this room is designed. It's been sealed off, as if we're not supposed to be here," Norman said, trembling. "Don't be foolishly superstitious. It's just a corpse," my father snapped, ordering them to begin the excavation immediately or face a week's docked pay. Evidently, that threat was enough to get everyone to work. Over the next few hours, we tirelessly chipped away at the ice surrounding the body. As we got closer, it was clear this wasn't a body from 30 years ago. No, it was much older, perhaps from the Inca era or other indigenous tribes. I silently speculated as we began to pull it from the Isa lost soul forgotten by the cruel flow of time. Once the body was within reach, I could clearly observe its features. A chilling sense of foreboding enveloped me. It was hard to recognize this as once a human being, for the body had no eyes, nose, or any facial contours. However, the overall shape indicated it was a small, middle-aged woman, curled in a fetal position. "The cold has mummified it. Perhaps the internal organs are still intact," my father remarked, pointing out that decomposition had stopped at some point after burial. The way the body was placed in the ice clearly suggested this death was intentional. Someone had deliberately placed them here to ensure they could never leave. That evening, after dinner, Dr. Hallett began examining samples from the body. I couldn't swallow a single bite, my mind haunted by the image of the corpse. My father, meanwhile, seemed very excited, insisting we be present to observe the process as they used crude tools to extract blood samples from the frozen mummy. With this sample, we can determine the time of death and perhaps learn more about our new friend, he explained, his eyes sparkling. His gaze made me wonder what his true intentions were, but I dared not question him. Meanwhile, the excavation team in the cave had paused their work, both curious and terrified by the mummy. Many on the team are very superstitious. They think this is a curse upon us, Norman explained, adding, especially since Manuel is now very ill, unable to leave his bed after inhaling those cursed chemicals. I scoffed at the absurdity, but the body genuinely unnerved me, especially as Dr. Hallett clarified more of its features. Legri stood nearby, meticulously documenting the entire process with his professional camera. I didn't need photos to preserve the memory. That horrifying sight was etched into my mind forever, never to fade. The body was covered in open sores, as if a flesh-eating bacteria had ravaged it from head to toe, including the chest cavity and face. When they drilled into the deformed left arm, the bone examination results confirmed what I and the doctor had already said to all of us. They were still alive when placed in the ice pit, he said, examining the sample under the microscope. My God, my father exclaimed in amazement. It was the first time I'd heard anxiety in his voice. Perhaps not entirely so. Look here, the doctor said, showing him. Then I, too, peered through the microscope, revealing organisms resembling tiny worms moving among the remnants of bone marrow. As they writhed and began to spin, a chill ran down my spine. This is a pathogen, a bioweapon, and that explains why they were buried so quickly. The ancients wanted to stop the infection, I asked Dr. Hallett. It will take more time to research. I can take more samples from the more intact organs. Although the cells have decomposed, it's very possible the virus still exists deep within the body, he replied. Proceed immediately, I said, unable to hide my eagerness. He nodded and returned to the makeshift morgue, grabbing his instruments and beginning to melt away the remaining layers of ice. My father squeezed my hand. We both stood in silence, captivated by what was unfolding before our eyes. We needed to know if we were in danger. The answer became clear in just a moment. As the last membranes of ice melted away, Dr. Hallett paused and increased the room temperature, eagerly beginning the actual autopsy. Looking at the body in this new light, I felt unease surge again, realizing how much pain this strange illness had caused that poor soul. Then, from thin air, the body suddenly twitched. Dr. Hallett screamed in fright and dropped his surgical instruments. The sudden breath from the body was enough to freeze him in terror. My father and I stood there, stunned in horror, unable to believe our eyes. The body barely moved, but the signs were too clear. Whatever we had found, it was still alive. Quarantine, perhaps, has become too familiar in this age. I'm sure many of you think you know all about it, but you are wrong. This word takes on a whole different meaning when you're stuck in a desolate, cold place with nothing around but a corpse beginning to reanimate. Less than 6 hours after we discovered the Andes mummy might still contain living tissue, the administrators sealed off the entire area, demanding we await further instructions, and above all, that no one be allowed to leave. Easier said than done. News of how the body reacted to the doctor spread like wildfire throughout our team, and although the corpse now seemed to have returned to its inert state, none of us dared to go near it, let alone be in the same room. Moreover, panic began to creep in, spreading among the workers and even the seasoned scientists. None of us had ever witnessed anything this horrifying before. We need to clearly define what we're dealing with, my father insisted that evening as we gathered in the common dining hall. It's a demon, an evil force from the other world, Norman shouted, and his workers murmured in agreement. I realized it wouldn't be long before they rebelled, demanding to leave this living hell. Or perhaps the microscopic infectious cells have mutated and taken control of the body, allowing a new life form to manipulate the corpse, I proposed, ignoring their superstitious words. If we could prove this threat was merely a natural phenomenon, perhaps the panic would be somewhat alleviated, or so was my faint hope. But people rarely listen to reason in a crisis, and this situation was no exception. For a while, my father's assertion that we should stay on the opposite side of the building and focus on the excavation seemed to calm their fears. At least they could bury themselves in work, forgetting their anxieties in the icy caves below. After dinner, unable to sleep, The workers returned to the mountain, while Dominic called me out to meticulously examine the photos he had taken of the mummy. I thought I had memorized enough details about the horrible illness covering that body, but Dominic's photos depicted them with such chilling realism that I shivered. The camera's sharp lens allowed him to zoom into the deep wounds, and through them, I discovered another dangerous detail. Mold, very likely the source of the microscopic bacterial infection, slowly growing from thousands of tiny pores on the body. I've seen spores like these before, deep in the Amazon rainforest. There's an extremely dangerous fungus that can control insects to spread throughout the vegetation. I'm almost certain this is something similar, my father said after scrutinizing the photos. I sensed a wavering doubt in his voice. Was he afraid this journey would end as tragically as my mother's? No, not exactly similar, but an ancient variant, a giant supervirus accidentally awakened, he admitted, his gaze fixed on the sealed room. Occasionally, we could still hear the strange, heavy, intermittent breathing of the reanimating mummy. I wondered if it was the fungus trying to push out more spores and fill the lungs. It was hard to ignore that haunting, ominous sound, but my father insisted we stay away. If only I had listened to him. The turning point came when I went to check on Manuel. Another worker, Jarvis, was sitting beside him, using cold compresses to bring down his fever, but it was clear Manuel was not well. His body trembled violently, and his breathing was heavy, as if something had invaded and taken root deep in his lungs. I quickly called Dr. Hallett to examine and assess his condition, but Dr. Hallett was no longer strong enough to assist us. After waiting for over 30 minutes without seeing him, I anxiously went to the medical room and found him unconscious, profusely sweating, slumped on the floor. Just a glance at his arm gave me the answer. The part scratched by the mummy was now horrifyingly swollen, bruised, and inflamed. Something was infecting him and causing him excruciating pain. I rushed to get water, trying to wake him and check the severity of his wound. How could it spread so fast? Hallett slowly opened his eyes, and I could see the deep pain in his soul. He was afraid but tried to hide it from me. "I'm just a little dizzy," he insisted as I helped him up, careful not to cause further pain to his swollen arm. "Why didn't you report it immediately when you noticed unusual symptoms?" I chided. I realized there was no point in pretending the situation wasn't serious. "We have to find a cure for you immediately," I said. "And what are you going to do?" "Amputate my arm? It's useless. The virus has already spread throughout my body, Angie," he yelled, the fear he had long tried to hide now spilling out, etched on his haggard face. "If we don't do something, it will kill you." "I'd rather die than let the whole team get infected," he replied curtly. I shook my head, deciding not to waste time arguing with a dying man. "You might think you're sacrificing yourself, but Manuel is already seriously ill. I think his lungs are already filled with mutations from the initial spores, but I need your help to conduct a full examination," I said as we left his small room. Hallett nodded, motioning for me to lead him to where Manuel lay. As he began the examination, Hallett apologized that we didn't have enough equipment to sedate Manuel. "Angelia, tie him down," he said, pointing to a pile of clothes nearby, suggesting I could use them as restraints. "Are you serious? He can barely stand, let alone once I start. He'll most likely struggle violently," Hallett explained. I immediately took the clothes, tore them, and stuffed them into Manuel's mouth beforehand, just in case he screamed. "The only way for me to get an accurate sample is to cut into his lung," the doctor explained, his hands trembling as he prepared the surgical instruments. I intended to tell him to wait longer, to try and postpone the horrible impending event, but he already made the first incision into Manuel's chest. As expected, Manuel screamed, his cry muffled by the cloth in his mouth. I tried to hold him still and asked Norman to do the same. He stood there silently, observing the entire process without a word. All of us had to exert all our strength to prevent Manuel from breaking free as the doctor continued to cut away parts of his body. But as he opened a cavity to access the lung, a strange, foul chemical stream suddenly sprayed from Manuel's body, hitting Hallett directly. The doctor immediately choked, collapsing. He fell backward, dropping his surgical instruments, clutching his throat as he crumpled to the floor. I stood far away, too terrified to approach, unable to comprehend what those monstrous spores were doing to his body. A moment later, the doctor stopped breathing, exhaling his last breath. For a moment, I completely forgot about Manuel. He suddenly sprang up, violently elbowing my side, acting like a cornered wild animal. Grabbing the scalpel, he brandished it wildly in the air, frantically defending himself. "Don't touch me, you bastards, do you hear me?" He roared as he retreated from the room. "Manuel, you're not well, we're just trying to help you." Norman tried to persuade him, but in vain. "I'm getting out of this hell and none of you can stop me," Manuel said, his hand clutching his wound to stop the heavy bleeding. He staggered out of the room and Norman instinctively started to follow, but I stopped him in time. "He can't go far, even if he leaves here. Think about where we are," I said, trying to calm Norman. I walked over to Dr. Hallett's body, trying to examine the damage the spores had inflicted in such a short time. I saw that vile virus beginning to rot and decompose his flesh at a terrifying speed. Even the distinctive smell of death disappeared, as if he had never existed, never been a living being. But I could still hear the heavy, raspy breathing coming from his chest. The thought that he might still be suffocating, slowly dying, sent a chill down my spine. "Contact my father immediately." "We need to move his body to the same room as the mummy," I ordered Norman, who stood speechless, still traumatized by what had just happened. I tried to remain calm, not letting anyone see the panic screaming inside me. This is a nightmare, but I forced myself to focus. "Go, Norman, you must follow orders. We can't waste another second." I told my father everything about Manuel's condition first. Needless to say, he was furious. "That scoundrel cannot leave. What the hell were you thinking, Angelia? What if this virus is airborne?" He growled, almost losing control. Quickly, he checked the limited security system we had and breathed a sigh of relief. No exits had been activated. "The boy is still here, perhaps hoping to recover before escaping," he said, trying to regain his composure. "I'm sorry, I didn't think of that," I confessed, feeling a fresh wave of guilt. My father told Dominic and Norman to arrange Hallett's body next to the mummy while he gave me other orders. "Find that boy and bring him back here. If he's also dying from the same thing as these others, we need to know why Manuel isn't affected in the same way. That might be the key to our survival," he explained. Then he handed me a pistol in case the boy became aggressive. "Don't hesitate to defend yourself," my father said, his eyes serious. Remembering how Manuel had just attacked us so frantically, I wisely took the gun and began searching the facility. In my mind, I tried to deduce where Manuel could have gone. With a cramped building like this, the options weren't many, but if his goal was to escape outside, perhaps I should start looking in unused, abandoned areas. I went to one of the old tunnel entrances that used to lead to the observatory and noticed bloody shoe prints, confirming he had passed through here. I turned on my phone's flashlight to illuminate the dark, damp staircase, calling his name. I didn't expect an answer. The abandoned, cold observatory, like a tomb, was one of the first places to collapse after the terrible landslide years ago. As I carefully stepped over the rubble and advanced onto the mountainside, I thought again about how these rocks might have been what claimed my mother's life. We can't know exactly where her team met their end, I thought as I continued to call Manuel's name. A gentle, soft summer rain began to fall on the mountain. As I carefully navigated the slope towards the next section, the ruined observatory left him with few options other than trying to climb down. I saw Manuel carefully moving among the rocks, clutching the surgical knife close to his chest, trying to find a clear path. "You need to stop before you hurt yourself," I yelled at Manuel. His wild eyes turned to me, then he shouted a curse in his native tongue as he began to run away. That reaction didn't surprise me. His fight-or-flight instinct had taken over, overriding reason. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest as I thought of my father's warning. The nearest village was over 40 miles away, but who knew if there were indigenous tribes hidden in the dense jungle below? Manuel absolutely, unequivocally could not be allowed to leave here. In desperation, I jumped onto the next section of the staircase. The old metal steps creaked and swayed violently. I continued to yell Manuel's name, but he didn't hear, not just because of me. Something had drowned out my calls, a terrifying sound from above. We both froze in astonishment, listening as the sound grew louder and clearer. At first, I panicked, thinking it was an avalanche. Then I saw a dark, menacing squadron of helicopters tearing through the sky, piercing the gray clouds. They brought me no sense of reassurance, especially when I realized who was operating those machines. This was the military. All of them were heavily armed. I saw AK-47s, grenades, and knives as long as an arm. As the helicopters approached, one of the soldiers drew a sniper rifle, and my heart sank. A cold, sharp red beam sliced through the dim air as they aimed at Manuel. I don't remember if I screamed. I know I wanted to stop the impending tragedy. Between the roar of the engines and the falling rain, they pulled the trigger, and the bullet tore through Manuel's face. Blood spurted from his forehead. His body jerked backward like a puppet, then collapsed onto the cold ground. Just seconds later, long ropes were lowered to the ground, and soldiers began to rappel down to where I stood. I trembled, stunned by their cold, ruthless indifference towards the man they had just killed. Did they know he was infected, or did they simply want to ensure none of us could escape from here? My unspoken question was answered soon after. An officer with gleaming insignias on his uniform stepped up, pointing his gun at Manuel's corpse once more. This facility is now under our control. Hands on your head and lie on the ground immediately, all of you. I was herded like cattle back to the common dining hall. Armed soldiers blocked all exits as they searched the entire facility. My father and Dominic were already there, both looking anxious at the sudden arrival of this group. "The perimeter is secured, sir," one of the younger soldiers reported to their commander. I was still trembling after witnessing them casually shoot Manuel right in front of me. "Who are you people?" my father asked boldly, stepping towards the highest-ranking officer. "Professor Camel, I understand you have questions, but you needn't be surprised. The university sent us as soon as they heard about the discovery you made. I am George Kelly, colonel with the U.S. Army Special Forces." "Since when did the military assist universities?" I asked. "Since we deemed this site a potential threat to international security," Kelly replied, then turned to my father, clearly viewing him as being in charge. "Where is the mummy, Professor?" "I want to see it with my own eyes." I tugged on my father's arm and whispered, "Why do we have to cooperate with what they want? Father, you saw what they did to Manuel. They could kill us all." Kelly's sharp eyes turned towards me. "And we still can if we see the virus continuing to spread among you. But we are not barbarians. We will assess the situation first and then determine the best course of action," he responded coldly. Then he turned back to my father, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. "Furthermore, to be precise, you requested our assistance when you contacted Principal Schwarz," he remarked. My father sighed and looked at me with an apologetic gaze before saying, "We can argue about my mistakes later. Their expertise might be useful in identifying what we're facing." Without another word, my father led them to the room where we had sealed Hallett's body and the original mummy. It suddenly dawned on me that since the doctor's sudden death, I hadn't returned to check if the spores had continued to spread. When we turned on the lights outside to get a better view of the field hospital, I couldn't stop myself from shuddering in discomfort. "My God," one of the soldiers whispered as we looked through the glass at the horrifying spectacle taking shape inside. In the short time we had been gone, the virus had spread throughout Hallett's body. It had even created strange, flesh-like web structures that reached out and connected with the mummy just a few meters away. It was evolving into a new type of organism. Just seeing that bizarre mass of flesh writhe and swell as if it had its own set of lungs was enough to send chills down my spine. "We don't know what we're dealing with, and it's getting worse," I realized. "How long has it been since Dr. Hallett died?" the colonel asked, his eyes still fixed on the terrifying mass of flesh. "It's almost visibly growing before our eyes." "An hour or two, 3 at most," I replied, completely horrified, unable to believe it was spreading so fast. "But the evidence is right before our eyes. If this continues, the entire facility could be infected within a final hour," my father declared. "Is this sealed?" Kelly asked, checking the vents before we could answer. He gave a new order. "We need to destroy this thing before we're all in danger, unless any of you are already infected and serving as hosts." For the first time, he said something that made sense. I knew this discovery was historic, but the risk to civilization was too great. It needed to be stopped right here. My father, contrary to expectations, immediately protested vehemently. "We must collect samples before making such a drastic decision. We don't even know what we're up against," he countered. My father stepped to where Colonel Kelly stood, blocking the way, and forced the soldiers to look him in the eye. "This is the greatest discovery in centuries. This virus originates from the fungal kingdom, a rarity. DNA analysis, even from a tiny fraction of infected tissue, could open up years of research for the scientific community. We could even determine the evolutionary link between the virus and fungi," he said. "I understand what you're thinking, but the situation has gone beyond our control," I said, pulling my father aside. "You have to let them do their job. We'll find other samples in the ice. This mountain is big enough, Father." My father pursed his lips, clearly unhappy with my answer, and looked at Kelly and his soldiers with angry eyes. All right, but at least you must allow my team to return to the excavation area. Any additional samples we find will be kept intact in the ice to prevent further spread. Is that a fair agreement, Colonel? The senior officer nodded reluctantly, then ordered soldiers Hansen and Albright to get the equipment from the trunk and bring it here immediately. We will incinerate this entire area, he roared. About half an hour later, Hansen, Albright, and 2 other soldiers appeared with flamethrowers while Colonel Kelly asked me to unseal the room. Honestly, I didn't know how that fleshy creature would react to exposure to outside air, so I insisted that everyone wear the biohazard suits Kelly had brought. A little protection is better than none, I said as I opened the metal door, and the soldiers entered, carrying tanks of flammable liquid on their backs. I stood on the other side of the glass, holding my breath and watching, asking Dominic to record everything. Even if this is erased from history, we need a record for the world to know we had no other choice, I said. Legri, mesmerized by the bizarre fungal virus, slowly acknowledged my words. The soldiers cautiously approached Hallett's writhing body and aimed the nozzles directly at it, eager to end this nightmare. Flames shot out, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. I watched the fire sweep across the mass of flesh, beginning to melt it. What happened next was horrifying, haunting me forever. The creature suddenly moved. From the mass of flesh, a mummy's hand reached out and clawed directly at the leading soldier's biohazard suit. In shock, he fell backward, flames shooting to the ceiling. Immediately after, we saw the bizarre, faceless mummy creature, like a puppet, propelled, moving around the room. Fire spread everywhere. It slammed against the glass where I stood, with the force of a freight train. The ulcerated mass of flesh stared at me. Tiny spores erupted from its distorted face, spraying toxic chemicals directly onto the glass. If not for the protection, they would have directly touched me. The reanimated creature fell backward, crawling like a crab towards another soldier trying to help Jensen up. The wounds on its body continuously opened and closed, spewing more spores into the air. As Kelly ordered the soldiers to retreat and destroy the monster, Dominic tried to capture everything, but it happened too fast. Then the creature slammed into the glass again, this time cracking it. Legri instinctively protected me. We backed away as the creature began to squeeze through the shattering glass. New wounds on its body emitted strange hissing sounds. Back, back, go! Dominic yelled in a panic as the glass finally shattered. In just a few seconds, I was sure we would be the next ones infected, but Colonel Kelly activated another flamethrower, incinerating the body with maximum power. We rushed for cover as the creature let out a piercing shriek and writhed on the floor, unable to escape the flames. It clawed at the ground like a mad dog while the fire rapidly consumed its flesh. The creature convulsed and screamed for a few more seconds as Kelly moved closer, ensuring the fire burned every part of its body. Then the room fell silent, and the immortal creature was motionless once again. Kelly wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at me with serious eyes. Call your father over the radio. The agreement is off. We cannot allow any more samples to be taken from here, he ordered. Although we tried to persuade him, my father didn't want to stop the excavation. This is still my site. You came here to supervise us, right? Then do your job and I'll do mine, he stubbornly told the colonel. This irritated Kelly, and the two launched into a heated argument. 3 of my men are dead. You're dealing with an unidentified organism. This virus is not something to experiment with playing God, Professor, he growled. And until I receive orders from the university, from your superiors, I will continue the excavation. If we only collect data and send it elsewhere, that harms no one. The world deserves to know, my father retorted. Kelly exhaled sharply and pointed at me. Your daughter was almost killed when that corpse attacked. Next time, what if we're not so lucky? How much more blood do you want on your hands? Kelly asked. That statement made my father pause, but before he could reply, Norman shouted from the excavation area. Professor Camel, we just found a new chamber, the team leader yelled. My father immediately abandoned the argument and ran towards the excavation area, eager to see. I followed, more cautiously but no less curious. The hole in the ground looked at least 200 feet deep or more, but there were clear signs of an ancient civilization beneath us. Even with limited light, I could see small structures protruding from the earth wall, but none seemed designed for actual living. When the team brought more heavy equipment and shone brighter lights, what I saw became clear. These were combined blocks of crystals, fused over centuries, frozen and forgot. But what lay beneath the ice confused me even more. We saw dozens, if not hundreds, of other mummified bodies, and that pulled me back to reality as I realized the significance of this discovery. This was an entire civilization sealed off due to an epidemic. All of them had been infected, and we had just found the mass grave where they sacrificed themselves to prevent the spread. As a scientist, there are moments in my life I can look back on and feel proud that I did the right thing for the right reasons. But my time in the Andes was not one of those moments. When I recall those dark, ice and snow-filled days and what we found there, all I have is a heart full of regret. Kelly insisted that we contact the university immediately to request permission to incinerate the entire catacomb we had discovered. However, their response was not what any of us expected. This site needs to be fully excavated. Its historical value outweighs everything else. Besides, it's still frozen, right? As long as there's no change in temperature, there will be no risk, the principal asserted. I couldn't believe their audacity, thinking this was safe, but it wasn't surprising given how our country had responded to the COVID pandemic. None of them took this danger seriously. To them, this was simply an unfortunate discovery. Alas, now that the order had been given, I knew that Colonel Kelly and his team would carry it out, so my only option was to try and cause as much trouble for them as possible. I sought out Norman, the team leader, who had been drinking since Manuel's death, barely speaking to anyone and not leaving his room. With the prospect that we might face a similar demise, I didn't blame him. The strange creature we discovered was growing by the hour, and now there was no one to stop it. No one except us. "What you're asking would be considered treason, you know that, right?" Norman said as I laid out my plan. In short, I knew the excavation team had brought explosives to break through harder rock sections, but that explosion could also prevent them from digging deeper. This was a dangerous gamble, especially since it could cost more lives. Honestly, I wasn't sure what Norman would decide, but after a few difficult seconds of silence, he drained his last glass of whiskey and slammed it onto the floor. "Damn it! I'd rather die here than let the whole world get infected with this monstrosity," he decided. "Gather as many of your men as possible. We'll start in the middle of the excavation tonight, all right?" I said. He promised not to tell anyone else, and I moved on to my next challenge. My father had been quieter since Kelly's arrival, but I could see he was also very worried. I needed him on my side if this plan was to have a chance of succeeding. I knocked on his door and found him looking at an old family photo, a picture of my mother. He smiled when he saw me, clearly surprised. "Angie, I'm sorry. I thought I should be out with the others, preparing everything." "It's okay. Kelly and his team have it handled," I said as I entered and sat beside him. "I wish your mother were still here," he said, his eyes a little wet. "What do you think she would do?" I whispered. He shrugged, put the photo down, and looked at me. "I know she would be proud of the woman you've become. This expedition has shown me how strong you are." I smiled, but my heart ached as I realized my father trusted me implicitly. "Father, this is much bigger than we thought. I think we've gone too far," I said gently. "Perhaps, but things are out of our hands now," he admitted. I bit my lip and shook my head. "Not entirely. I think we can still make a difference, but I might need your help." "Angie, I know you'll do what you think is right. I know you have a lot to say, but I'm tired. Wait until morning after the next excavation, all right?" he said. I sighed, not wanting to argue. We were risking too much. Instead, I gave him a hug, then returned to my room across the hall, trying not to think about what would happen in the morning. No matter how I imagined it, the outcome wouldn't be pleasant, but it still had to be done. Sleep somehow crept into my weary brain, carrying me through the cold night. Occasionally, I heard my father's faint wheezing, which terrified me to my core. The first thing I did when I woke up was to check him for any signs of infection. "Just old age," he said as we walked down to the excavation area. Kelly's team, along with armed soldiers, had advanced towards the mass grave we had discovered, eager to dig deeper into this hell. Not a single soldier wavered before their commander's orders, but I didn't expect them to. They were ready to follow him to hell if necessary, I thought as I saw Norman and the rest of his team arrive with their equipment. Legri stood near the edge of the ice with his camera, silently observing everything. Norman gave me a slight nod, a subtle gesture assuring me his team was still on my side, but I couldn't stop worrying as they began to work, and I took my father's hand, wondering how things would unfold. I didn't have to wonder for long. My father pulled his hand away and walked towards the colonel. At first, I didn't understand until I saw his familiar stern expression, the face he always wore when preparing to deliver a lecture. My heart sank. "Father, what are you doing?" I asked. "Sir, I'm not sure what my daughter is planning, but I believe she intends to sabotage this operation," he said, immediately ordering 2 soldiers to escort me aside. I almost resisted, but Kelly's eyes showed he wouldn't hesitate to shoot me. "Father, don't do this," I pleaded, but his resolute eyes showed there was no turning back. Immediately after, armed soldiers moved towards the workers' team, forcing them to turn on their machinery. "Any wrongdoing will be considered a death sentence," the colonel sternly declared as he gave the order. I watched the huge drills pierce through the ice as if summoning an evil force. Haven't they learned anything from the past 48 hours? I shouted, trying to get Norman's attention as the drill went deeper and deeper. And then I started to see thick, black liquid oozing up from between the cracks. It wasn't oil. It moved like the previous body. "How much further to the next chamber?" Kelly yelled amidst the crowd, but Norman didn't hear. He continued to drill, his eyes full of determination. Then I realized his plan. He knew he wouldn't survive. I bit my tongue and held my breath as he entered a sequence of commands on his equipment, then closed his eyes. I knew it would happen, but the explosion still reverberated, deafening. A few soldiers were thrown back by the force, but those closest to the blast truly faced a nightmare. From the epicenter, I saw what looked like grotesque fungus growing, just barely textured enough to resemble a living organism, stumbling, seeking anything to consume. It hissed like the shriek of a ferocious bird of prey swooping down on its quarry. A second explosion, just loud enough to drown out the creature's horrifying shriek, came as the equipment fell into the pit. I saw Norman's crane tip headfirst into the abyss, and I cried out in alarm, but it was too late. Legri also fell into the monster's maw, and I knew it was over. Immediately after, other heavy equipment followed as the cave began to collapse. Kelly yelled, ordering everyone to retreat. I saw the desperate fungal masses crawling towards us, trying to infect and spread. I ran for my life as if the devil himself were chasing me. The ground beneath my feet shook like ocean waves as I frantically sought an escape. Soldiers also screamed in panic, running and avoiding the spores scattered from the exploded creature. Millions of spores filled the air like a deadly rain. We barely made it to the next tunnel when the cave ceiling began to collapse. My body went numb, stunned. This was how my mother had died. Was history repeating itself? In that moment of chaos, I felt myself frozen amidst a crumbling world around me. Then I felt a strong pull. Kelly, defying all danger, had risked his life to pull me from the collapse. When we returned to the central area, the last tremors finally stopped. We checked to see how many survivors there were. Besides me and Colonel Kelly, only 3 soldiers and my father remained, all looking like they had barely escaped death. "Report any injuries?" the colonel asked. I staggered to my feet, grabbed my father, and shoved him hard against the wall. "Someone will be injured right now if you don't explain what the hell you were thinking, trying to dig deeper." I love my father, but in that moment, all I felt was blind rage. "How could you be so reckless?" "Angelia, I just wanted your mother's legacy to be remembered. I didn't want things to turn out this way," he said softly, his eyes filled with regret mixed with bewilderment. I saw he was telling the truth, so I let go. Then I turned to the soldiers. "We need to get out of here before the rest of the cave chamber collapses." Kelly, despite trying not to show the pain from the explosion, checked on the soldier's condition, then nodded grimly. "This site has been severely compromised. Any remaining components of the creature are likely too deep in the Earth's strata, making access impossible, and without equipment, nothing can continue." I was genuinely surprised to see him being so rational, but the losses we had suffered were too great. No matter how miraculous this discovery, we had no choice but to leave. "Let's move to the observatory, it's closest to the surface. We'll be safe there while calling for transport," Kelly suggested. The soldiers obeyed. My father reluctantly followed. Kelly announced that rescue would arrive in the morning. The cold air swept through the observatory like a grim reminder of the destruction we had wrought by disturbing this ancient tomb. My mind still reeled from what had happened below, but I knew there was one last hurdle to overcome before we returned to civilization. I approached where my father was and heard a strange wheezing sound, identical to the one I had heard when the mummy reanimated. I rushed in to save him. Knocking on the door, I found my father coughing violently, blood staining his sleeve. The sight turned me pale. I rushed to his side and said, "Father, you're infected, aren't you? Let me check." "Angelia, I'm fine, it's just old age." He tried to reassure me, pushing me away. I shook my head and told him to sit down, quickly getting the first aid kit. "No, Father, you're not going anywhere until I'm sure you're healthy," I said. He reluctantly agreed, trying to suppress another cough. Using a stethoscope, I listened to his lungs, and what I heard horrified me. This was worse than I thought. I recoiled, looking at my father with wide eyes. "Father, you're sick and you tried to hide it. Why, is this the virus we found?" He shook his head, trying to hide the truth. "You don't understand, Angie. This is what your mother would have wanted. This could change the world." I stood up, furious. "Father, you cannot leave here infected. You could kill billions. Look at what's happening right now. What you're thinking would be genocide." "We don't have the right to decide what nature has intended," he retorted fiercely. I saw fear and frustration in his eyes. I also saw denial. He believed what he was saying, and I knew what I had to do. I put my hands on his neck, pushing him against the wall, tightening my grip. I saw him struggle, but I couldn't let another nightmare happen. I cried and sobbed as I continued to press my fingers into his windpipe. Then it was over. In the last moments of his life, I saw spores begin to emerge from his throat, and I knew I had done the right thing. Standing there, dazed, watching my father's body fall at my feet, I gathered my belongings and returned to my room. When the sun rose and Kelly reported that rescue had arrived, I left the Andes alone. I didn't want to know what we had left behind or if it would ever be found again, but I prayed that it was all buried forever. And if you believe in any higher power protecting us, I beg you to do the same.